First, what we want you to do is take a minute and think about what comes to mind when you hear the word algebra. You can write about your experiences with algebra or what do you think it means, just the first thing that comes to mind. No, this is...
Okay, so what comes to mind? Does anybody have anything that comes to mind when you think about algebra? Good.
I think of X and Y
Yes.
and variables.
Is that it, or anything else? What do you do with X and Y?
Equations.
Equations?
Kind of fun.
Yeah.
Fun?
Yeah, because you have to play it.
Any bad experiences with algebra? No? Yeah.
I think it's hard because
Okay.
there's so many different math concepts that go into it. So if you're like weaker in one of those, then it kind of makes the whole thing more difficult.
Anyone else? No?
Well, algebra is the branch of mathematics that deals with general statements of relationships utilizing letters and other symbols to represent specific sets of numbers, values, vectors, etc. In the description of such relationships. And algebra is broken up in 4 different categories, which is pre-algebra, algebra 1, algebra 2, and geometry.
And the main thing to remember about algebra is that it focuses on relationships between numbers.
Yeah. And what we're going to focus on again too a little bit later is basically pre-algebra, because that's what you guys will be teaching your students.
Okay, so a Persian mathematician named Muhammad, I don't know how to say the whole name, but
Al-Khwarizmi.
okay. He's the father of algebra, and he was able to compose rules for solving linear and quadratic equations. The word algebra comes from the Arabic word algebra. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but the meaning is completion, which makes sense because when you're solving equations, you're solving for a certain variable, and once you find that variable, it's complete because you solve the answer and the equation makes sense. Many ancient civilizations developed algebraic methods of solving problems. Babylonians, they developed a positional number system to aid them in solving cubic and quadratic equations. The ancient Greeks, they used geometric algebra. And the Egyptians were concerned with using linear equations.
And again, like we talked about earlier, it's good to know the history so you're able to talk to your students and relate to why some different individuals use different ways of calculating algebra. Like we said, pre-algebra, the topics that you will be teaching is factors, primes, fractions, percentage, and order of operations. Which all deals with relationship between the numbers.
And something simple as realizing that the equal sign represents a relationship is part of how kids in elementary school go through algebraic thinking. And today we're going to focus on what type of algebra do third graders learn.
Alright, so this was the Common Core Standards. It represents and solves problems involving multiplications and division. Determine the unknown whole number in a multiplication or division equation relating 3 whole numbers. So this was an example, but we're going to show another example that you guys could use in the classroom. And it's a game to really get the kids thinking of where exactly numbers go when we're trying to solve a problem.
And then if you see here in these examples, they're not necessarily using like letters and variables like we're used to thinking about algebra. It could just be like a missing space or a question mark so that they can see what number you put in so that the equation makes sense.
And even a lot of times I noticed like when I was tutoring that the numbers kind of confuse them a little bit even more. I mean the letters, sorry, confuse them even a little bit more. Even if you're using like X, for example, a lot of people think of X as multiplication. So instead of using a letter, you can use a blank space. So you said this is already up, right? Or just click
It's
on
already up, but you can try. Okay.
Alright, so basically basically what you're going to do is you're going to drag the numbers so the equation makes sense. So you could have a certain amount of questions, and then you can have a certain amount of minutes that you want to do your problems in with the class. So if you wanted to do it as a whole class, or if you wanted to do it individually, it all comes down to how many questions you want and how much time you want to give them. Alright, so for example, we would bring down 4, and then so 4 times 4 equals, does that make sense?
No.
So we have to bring down the 1 and then give the answer. And then next. And then if you mess up, say if you messed up. So you gotta try again. And then you move over. So that's just a game to really do with the children as well. And we wanted to present.
So basically, it's just you're giving them the spaces, and they have to play around with the numbers to make sure that it makes sense. So once again, it's not using any letters or variables, but it's just putting things in the right order to figuring out the problem.
And then we'll get more into this in our next slide.
Okay, so sum sense multiplication is a great way to introduce students to finding the unknown variables. The speed at which students solve each problem can shed light on how well students know their multiplication, because once again, it's timed, and the more practice they get, the quicker they'll finish the game. Teachers can also assess students based on how often students put the numbers in the correct order, so that it makes some sense. And,
Some sense.
and a guided math principle that we thought went with this activity is that learning mathematics is a constructive process. Once again, you're presenting them with this game, and they have to play around with the numbers to see what makes sense. So it's them constructing their own learning.
And it also helps them with their own factors as well. So it's really good.
Okay, and another standard that falls under 3rd grade is understanding properties of multiplication and the relationship between multiplication and division. So they learn about commutative property, associative property, but we're going to focus on, again, on distributive property. And it's basically just, writing out multiplication problems in different ways. 8 times 7 can also be written as 8 times 5 plus 2. And then when you distribute it, this is what you get. So we have another activity that we're going to do together.
Did you mix this on part?
No. And it's called I Have, Who Has. And it's based on using the distributive property to find like the matches that you have on your card. You'll see when you get it. Each person has I have and an expression, and then who has, and then an expression after that. You can give that to another person. So the object of the game is to see if your expression matches the one that the first person has on. So Joseph, do you want to start?
Sure.
You're going to write down on the board your who has expression. The who has expression.
Yes, because since you started, you will have to write who has instead of I have.